Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Lily's Little Life Corner. Today my whiteboard has not been touched because I was busy doing my makeup. But today we are going to be talking about something that has happened and something that a lot of people have been discussing and kind of discussing the ethics of, and that is Eleanor Neale's true crime tour. So that's what we're going to be discussing. But before we get into it, I am wearing my merch. This is the sweatshirt, and I designed this myself. No AI used. And it is available in the description or in the show notes. And as always, this podcast is available not just on YouTube, but also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And also another new and exciting thing, I now have a social media platform where you guys can look me up and see if there's any updates. I do update on my YouTube homepage whenever I am delayed, whenever a podcast episode is not going to be filmed or is not going to be uploaded. I always make sure to update the YouTube side of things, but I know some of you guys listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and so if you do and you don't want to go to YouTube, because like the whole point is to not be using YouTube when you're listening to your podcast, just head on over to tumblr.com/sappholily-YT. You have to include the YT, otherwise you're going to get my fandom page, and that's not useful to get updates. So make sure to include the -YT. But for those of you that are on YouTube, I will continue updating my YouTube page. It's just another location wherein you guys can find my updates. And then also, update from last episode, for those of you that are watching, I remembered that Kath had actually gifted me this sloth, which is a miniature version of the sloth that I got last week. Kath gifted this to me a while ago, and actually this one looks more like the gigantic sloth that I have. But it's an entire family of sloths. I might have to design a merch design based off of my 3 sloths. So if you guys are interested in that, just let me know. But anyway, without further ado, let me get into it, because this is a very nuanced discussion, very nuanced conversation. It's a very nuanced discussion to be having, and a lot of people have a bunch of different opinions, so we're going to get through some of those opinions, and then also I'm going to discuss some of my own opinions, and kind of just clue you guys into some things that are being left out of this conversation. And as always, I have written notes, so if you guys hear any paper rustling, it is my paper notes. So, if you guys don't know, Eleanor Neale is a true crime YouTuber. And if you guys don't know what a true crime YouTuber is, it's basically a person who covers cases. So they will sit down, they will research a case, and then they will get on video and tell you guys all about the case. Now, before anybody clicks off, I'm not going to be discussing any gruesome cases here because I have not done the research, and I don't think I am particularly qualified to be talking about such gruesome cases on a lighthearted podcast platform. So we are instead going to be talking about things like the ethics of researching and uploading true crime content on YouTube, as well as some of the other things that are being discussed within this conversation. So no gruesome talk here. You know, whenever I do discuss anything gruesome, I always make sure to give you guys a disclaimer. So be assured, we will not be discussing anything gruesome at all. So anyway, Eleanor Neale has 2.87 million subscribers on her YouTube channel, and she kind of had a reputation where a lot of people knew her as being respectful when covering such cases. That's the reputation that she had. Now, whether or not she was actually respectful, that's up to you to decide, but for the people who are in the true crime community, she would be somebody that you would go to if you wanted more empathetic coverage of the cases rather than a more sensational coverage of the cases. Recently, she announced that she was going on a true crime tour called the Outlore Tour with Eleanor Neale, and people did not react the way that she hoped that they would react. They had a very negative reaction, and in my opinion, for very good reason. But that's what we're going to be talking about, like I said, and discussing, the ethics and the morals behind going on a tour where all you're going to be talking about is true crime. Now, it must be stated, because I must remind you that true crime is crime that happened to real people. It is not a fictional, murder mystery. Oh, I got these things in the mail and we're gonna try and figure out who the culprit is. No, it's cases that happen to real people who have real families, some of whom, or most of whom, are still alive. Especially, some of these true crime YouTubers, they do tend to cover recent cases. So they're cases where family members and loved ones of the victims are still alive. So that's what she was going to be doing on stage. She was going to be getting on stage and talking about a recent homicide or a recent, sexual assault or whatever, kidnapping, missing person, and talking about it in an audience of people on stage. So, just for context, that is the situation that we're dealing with here. So, it's no surprise that people are not happy about this at all, especially with her reputation. Like I said at the beginning, she has a very known reputation, at least she used to before announcing this tour, of her being one of the more respectful YouTubers that would cover cases in a more respectful manner, and people just felt like going on tour was a complete 180 from what she represented herself as. Unfortunately, she is not the first and probably won't be the last to go on such a true crime tour where people are talking about real life cases with real life victims. Creators like Eleanor Neale are kind of the face of true crime. They're what I like to call mainstream true crime creators. So whenever a controversy happens within the true crime community, people like Eleanor Neale, Bailey Sarian, and Stephanie Sue are at the forefront of the discussion. Those are the creators that people know, even if you are not in the true crime community, even if you don't watch true crime, or you have seen or you have heard of Bailey Sarian, Eleanor Neale, Stephanie Sue. Those are the faces of true crime. So whenever a controversy happens, they're the ones getting the brunt of the hate comments. And that's not me saying that they don't deserve the criticism, but it is me saying that with this discussion that has been going on, a lot of people have missed a lot of things that are normal in the true crime community. And so a lot of people have been like, well, why are you guys only mad at Eleanor Neale, but you're not mad at all these other creators? And to answer that question, it's because Eleanor Neale is a face of true crime, and the other true crime creators that have done similar things, people don't know about within the mainstream. So we're going to discuss some of those things and as well bring them into this conversation. For example, did you guys know that there is such a thing called CrimeCon? It's a convention that's all about crime, and multiple true crime creators go to it, speak as guest speakers, or have a booth that you can visit and do a meet and greet with. And we're actually going to go on their website so you guys can see kind of what I'm talking about. So on their website, they say that they are the world's #1 true crime and mystery event. Let's take a look at some of the upcoming events. So there is CrimeCon 2026. It's going to take place in Las Vegas. There's sessions and panels. There's a creator row, which is where they invite podcast hosts and YouTubers. There's meet and greets. There's book signings. So any author that has written about a true crime case will probably be there. There's an expo hall where you can get to know some more podcast creators. There's demonstrations, interactive experiences, and people sharing their stories. So it's an entire convention of just people talking about crime. There's also Clue Awards. I'm not really sure what that is because I've never participated or attended. CrimeCon anything, but let's see. Clue Awards. Early submissions for the 2026 Clue Awards are open now. The CrimeCon Clue Awards celebrate outstanding projects that embody a strong commitment to leadership, understanding, and excellence. So 2 things I want you guys to be aware of here. The Clue Awards are celebrating excellence and leadership. So basically, they nominate or they look for podcast shows that show excellence in leadership. I'm assuming that means like top podcast hosts. They're not celebrating anything to do with the quality of the investigation, the quality of the presentation, nothing of the sort. They're only celebrating the viewership and how many votes that podcast gets. I'm also assuming that these Clue Awards are encompassing not just podcast shows, but also TV shows and YouTubers. The other thing I want you guys to be aware of is that me pointing out the CrimeCon exists is not me saying that Eleanor Neale is excused for wanting to create a true crime tour. I'm just saying we need to be talking about all of this. If we want the true crime community to change, we need to be talking about everything. So that is my point and purpose in bringing up CrimeCon. It is not to excuse anything that Eleanor Neale is doing or has done. It is simply to include more in the conversation and raise awareness to more of the things that are happening within this community. The awards recognize exceptional titles in categories such as TV, documentary films, podcasts, and publishing. This year marks the 5th edition of the awards. And so you can, I guess, nominate people. Let's see what the prices are. These prices are kind of crazy. And then there's different badge options. So the standard badge, which gets you all access weekend badge for CrimeCon 2026. They provide everything in CrimeCon weekend except for VIP only sessions. And it is $299, and that's at the discounted rate. The standard preferred rate is $379. Gold VIP they only say it's one of the best ways to experience CrimeCon 2026, so there's no like benefits listed on the website, but it is $899. And Platinum VIP, again, they only say it's one of the best ways to personalize your CrimeCon experience. It is $1,899, and that has been sold out. So needless to say, so many people are interested in this, and actually they have a promotional video where you can see the attendees cheering on the guest speakers, and the guest speaker, there's one in particular that goes on stage in like a very silly way. It almost kind of reminds me of those religious conventions or like MLM conventions, and by MLM I mean multi-level marketing, not men loving men, but that's what it reminds me of, where there's like emotional testimonies and the guests in the audience are crying but then like raising their hands up to God, and singing and dancing because the audience is singing and dancing for some reason. Like, this is about crime and you're singing and dancing, but okay. Last year, I guess they had Chris Hansen and Ice-T, which is Detective Tutuola from Law & Order Special Victims Unit. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I do find it interesting that they're inviting Ice-T instead of inviting somebody who was part of genetic genealogy or somebody who was kind of the inventor of genetic genealogy. I think those would be more important people, especially given today's new investigative methods, but that is just my own opinion. Again, I'll get into this later, but I just think it's irresponsible of such a community to be inviting a guy who's part of the cast of a show that spreads propaganda rather than inviting people who are actually part of investigations and who are actually important to investigations. But yeah, I'll talk about it a little bit later. But yeah, they just have like multiple podcast hosts there. They have multiple YouTubers there, people who host crime related shows, like the Dateline hosts, or like Oxygen Network will invite their, TV show hosts for whatever TV show they've done. So this is a very big convention, and it has a lot of really big names within the true crime community, such as like Paul Holes, which was involved in the Golden State Killer case. He was part of kind of the original team that thought to use genetic genealogy to figure out who the killer was. By the way, Paul Holes was the detective on the team that was investigating the original Night Stalker / Golden State Killer, and he had heard about genetic genealogy and decided to spend resources on using genetic genealogy to find out who the Golden State Killer was. And I just, again, I'll talk about this later, but I just find it interesting how the detective who thought to use genetic genealogy is getting more book deals and more book signings and more opportunities to speak at places like CrimeCon over the geneticist who actually did the work and who actually compared the genealogy and did the genetic genealogy. But yeah, topic for a little bit later. There's also, like I said, Chris Hansen was there. So it's a lot of big names within the true crime community, and it is a huge event. So in my opinion, and I'll get into this a little bit later, it kind of, especially if Eleanor Neale was actively involved in the community, and she wasn't just researching and uploading her own cases, but she was also watching other creators, it kind of, in my head, makes sense that she would think that this was a good idea because such a thing like CrimeCon exists. And that's, by the way, not me defending her or trying to excuse her behavior, but it is different when you are so involved in a community and you see the things that community has normalized, but then you also have access to the people outside of that community, if that makes sense. So it makes sense that her subscribers would kind of only watch her or other more respectable YouTubers, but she herself would watch creators involved with CrimeCon, and she would listen to podcast hosts who participate in CrimeCon and then think, okay, this is normal, this is what my subscribers also want, because CrimeCon is a very successful convention and it gets local press anytime they're in. Last year they were in Denver, and so Denver press picked it up. This year they're going to be in Las Vegas, so I'm sure the Las Vegas press will pick it up and talk about it. So it's very, like I said, successful. They have some of the big names going there. Nancy Grace, don't get me started on Nancy Grace. She also goes to CrimeCon. Like I said, Dateline hosts, they go to CrimeCon. So in my head, it makes sense that she would think that this was okay if she's watching the creators that her audience is not watching. I hope that makes sense. But I'll get into that a little bit later. Like I said, that's not me excusing anything. It's just me kind of trying to figure out, okay, well, why did she think this was okay? But anyway, like I said, CrimeCon has gone unnoticed by a lot of the people that are discussing the morality of going on a true crime tour, because not a lot of people know about CrimeCon. The only people that know about CrimeCon are those that are deeply in the community. And I only learned about CrimeCon because one creator that I watch mentioned that she was going to be at CrimeCon. And I was like, wait, what is that? And, she was showing clips of CrimeCon, and I went to go look it up myself, and it turns out it's a thing that happens every year. So when I saw people saying, well, so-and-so went on a true crime tour and nobody's complaining about that, I kind of rolled my eyes because, well, duh, that creator isn't well known outside of the true crime community. They're only well known within the true crime community, so their tour was able to be successful but also not be talked about because nobody else knows about that creator. For example, also, My Favorite Murder is a podcast that talks about murder, and it's called My Favorite Murder, and it only gets brought up when controversies about true crime are happening, but they themselves are not at the forefront of true crime controversies like a Bailey Sarian or a Stephanie Sue would be, right? So whenever My Favorite Murder goes on tour to talk about true crime, nobody talks about it because they're only mentioned when somebody else has a controversy, if that makes sense. So they're able to fly under the radar and participate in doing things like that because only the people within the true crime community know about them. Also, the creators that do go on a true crime tour tend to have an audience that is only watching them for them, not watching them for the crime. So, for example, Eleanor Neale has an audience that doesn't necessarily care about her. So whenever she posts like an update about her life, you know, whenever she says, oh, I broke up with my boyfriend, or I have a new boyfriend, or I'm going to university, or, you know, whatever the case may be, people aren't really interested in that because they only seek out her channel to learn about cases, to learn about the cases that she covers. However, people who listen to My Favorite Murder or people who watch Bailey Sarian tend to care more about Karen and Georgia and Bailey herself. So it's kind of like the cases are a bit of an afterthought for them, and Bailey and Karen and Georgia could easily transition into doing something different, like completely different, and the viewers would still watch them because the viewers are watching them for the hosts, if that makes sense. So if they were to go on a true crime tour, their audience wouldn't really care because they're watching for entertainment purposes, whereas audiences like Eleanor Neale's audience is watching not for entertainment but to learn about victims who have suffered through tragic cases. So that's also one of the reasons why people started being like, hey, wait a minute, what do you mean you're going on a true crime tour with Eleanor? But whenever the podcast My Favorite Murder goes on a true crime tour, nobody really bats an eye because, like I said, the people who are going to the My Favorite Murder tour are going because they know that Karen and Georgia are entertaining hosts, whereas Eleanor Neale's audience knows that she is going to prioritize victims. So they're not, like I said, they're not watching for her, they're watching for the victims. And this is really kind of a product of her own doing, if you really think about it, because ever since she started talking about true crime on her channel, up until this very moment when she announced that she was going on tour, she has positioned herself to be kind of a respectful person who covers true crime. Now, again, like I said, whether that is the case or not, or whether you believe that to be the case or not, that is how she has positioned herself, that is how she has marketed herself, and that is how most of her audience receives her. And so anytime she spreads misinformation, like harmful misinformation about the victims that she's covering, she's able to sweep that under the rug because she has such a reputation of being respectful and caring about the victims. My point is, her audience was kind of primed to not find a true crime tour in any way appealing because of the way that she positioned herself. She was not doing sensational coverage like Nancy Grace does. You know, she was not fear-mongering and saying, a killer could be right around your corner and you would never know, right? She was instead saying, like, look, this is the victim, we're going to talk about their lives, we're going to get to know them, and then we're going to talk about the crime that occurred, and then we're going to talk about the murderer. So she would center the victim most of the time. Sometimes she would center the killer, but most of the time she would center the victim and talk about the victim first, and then talk about the killer second, whereas most of the sensational type of Nancy Grace-esque creators tend to center the killer and the crime first and then say, oh yeah, and by the way, they also had these victims. I think Stephanie Sue is also a good kind of creator to talk about this, or to talk about in regards to this, because she had a glow up of sorts when doing true crime content. Back in the day when she started her true crime content on YouTube, she would be eating as she was describing gruesome crimes, and so a lot of people found that disrespectful. So she deleted all of her videos, and now she's doing Rotten Mango, which is her true crime podcast, and she is in direct communication with families. She is no longer eating as she's talking about these cases, but I say she's a really good example of kind of this divide because when she was doing mukbangs while talking about true crime, if she had announced that she was going on tour to talk about true crime, her audience would have eaten it up. And she probably would have kind of flown under the radar and people wouldn't have talked about it so much, because that's the kind of content that she was creating. That true crime content mixed with her vlogs made people care more about her rather than the content that she was covering. Whereas now, if she were to announce that Rotten Mango was going on tour and doing a true crime tour, the audience that she has now would not accept that at all. But yeah, that's kind of like what I mean is how you present the information and how you present yourself really affects the kind of audience you have and really affects what your audience is willing to tolerate. So again, like I said, my favorite murder, their audience is willing to tolerate true crime tour. Eleanor Neale, now Rotten Mango, people like Gabulosis, their audience would not be able to tolerate them going on a true crime tour. So why is a tour so controversial, but not the videos on YouTube or the podcasts that they're uploading on podcast platforms? What is the difference between talking about gruesome true crime on your social media platforms versus going on tour? Personally, I don't think I am the best person to talk about this because I do have a bias towards, watching true crime. But I guess as a true crime viewer and consumer, my answer to that question would be, well, on YouTube and on podcast platforms, you can be respectful. You can be calm and collected and talk about things in a respectful tone because your audience isn't really going out of their way to find you. More often than not, the content is free. So for example, if I were to be a true crime creator, I would be able to upload something and then you guys wouldn't be able to search up, whatever case I'm talking about, find my video, and then that's it. Like, that's the only thing that you have to do. The only currency that I ask from you is your time and attention. Whereas on tour, you're kind of going significantly out of your way to go to a tour. And this isn't just true crime tour. Of course, this is like music tours, book signing tours. You have to not just travel to get there, but you also have to look for a hotel. If maybe it's a little ways out of your way, you have to look for where you're gonna eat, right? Because often these tours, these shows that are going on tour, they're not just like in and out in 10 minutes. You're probably spending an hour and a half, 2 hours sitting in the same spot. Probably towards the end, you're going to be hungry, so you're going to want to look for some place to eat, or you're going to want to bring your own food. You also want to look for parking. Sometimes you have to pay for parking, or if you're not going in a car at all, you do have to pay for a train ticket or a bus ticket, and then you have to walk to whatever destination it is, whatever venue it might be at. So it is very inconvenient compared to a YouTube video or a podcast episode. So when people go on these tours, they're kind of expected because of the massive inconvenience compared to just youtube.com. Let me click on whatever video that catches my attention first. They're expecting to see more. You can't just on a tour, you can't just grab your chair and sit in the middle of the stage and be like, okay, today we are going to be talking about the tragic murder of blah, blah, blah. You have to entertain the audience, the live audience that is there. And often because it is a live audience, you can't just speak in a calm tone and have a microphone directly, in front of your face and speak in a calm, respectful tone, because sometimes there's audio issues, you need to shout, sometimes your audience will cheer for you, as crazy as that sounds, even if it is a true crime tour. I mean, just listen to My Favorite Murder, and whenever they do live episodes, the audience is cheering for them. As soon as they get on stage, the audience starts cheering. So you can't just be like, okay, you guys, today we're going to talk about blah, blah, blah. You have to be like, hey, oh my God, hi, how are you guys? And be entertaining because those people went out of their way to see you. So that personally for me is the difference between going on a true crime tour versus uploading YouTube videos from the comfort of your own home. And I hope I was able to explain that well, but yeah, it's just on a tour, you're expected to do more and act and put on a performance. And putting on a performance while talking about tragic cases just kind of is not the move, you know? I didn't mean to sound so California girl there, but yeah, it's just not the move. It's just not what people want to see, especially if your audience, like I said, has been so against the idea of you going on tour anyway. Like, if they were so predispositioned to be against the tour. And by the way, me saying that is not me in any way defending people who upload content. So I'm not saying like, oh, you should upload true crime content but never go on tour. No, there is a difference. What I'm saying is going on a true crime tour is disrespectful and inappropriate because the mere idea of the word tour suggests something exciting, and true crime should never be presented as exciting. But that is not me saying that you should instead upload videos on YouTube and talk about true crime, especially if you do not approach certain topics with the nuance and the respect that they deserve. Just because a YouTube video is not expected to be as exciting as a tour doesn't mean that it's the better option or that you should instead opt for that, if that makes sense. Like, there's so many disclaimers, but I really want to make my position clear that I'm not condoning tours by saying, oh, well, so many other people have done them, so like, what's the issue? No, but I'm also then not saying, well, tours are bad, but YouTube videos are good, right? Because, like I said, there's so many YouTubers that upload content in such a disrespectful manner and in such a disrespectful way that completely decenters the victim and centers influencer, which is what they are. They're true crime influencers, such as Bailey Sarian. She does her makeup while talking about true crime, and I just think that's something that you shouldn't do. If you claim to care about victims, which I don't think she's ever claimed to care about victims, and I guess that would be evident by the fact that she does her makeup as she's talking about true crime and then also talks about it in such a like gossipy way. So yeah, there definitely is a way that you can mess that up when uploading non-exciting videos on YouTube about true crime. If you were to ask me why I believe people like Bailey Sarian and My Favorite Murder and Nancy Grace have so many followers and so many listeners week in and week out, I would tell you that it's because they've been desensitized to the information that they're presenting. So Nancy Grace, Bailey Sarian, and the My Favorite Murder hosts tend to present the information in such a way that desensitizes you, and then also encourages you to listen to even more. So the amount of horrific information that you are surrounding yourself with also is a way of desensitizing you to what is actually going on in the world, and that's why people end up treating it like they're just gossiping with their friends or like it's a new TV show. Whenever a crime happens, that's why you will see people saying, oh, I can't wait for my favorite creator to cover it. It's because they started treating it like a TV show because that's how their favorite creator presents the information as. And I think the true crime community suffers from this a lot. I think the true crime community has normalized a lot of things that other communities would never normalize. Like I said, there is such a thing called Crime Con, and a lot of people buy that like $400 ticket at the cheapest, $2,000 ticket at the most expensive. And they will fly out to Las Vegas, they will travel to Las Vegas or to Denver, to wherever the convention is taking place that year, and they will comfortably sit there and listen to these performers on stage talk about real life tragedies and talk about real life victims, and they treat it like it's an anime convention or like it's a TV show convention, right? As if it were Comic-Con. And those are behaviors that have been highly normalized in the true crime community that a lot of people don't know about because they are not in the true crime community. And so I think that, yes, we should continue having this discussion to conclude. And in conclusion, I do think we should be continuing to have this discussion about Eleanor Neale and about how she messed up and about the ethics of going on a true crime tour. But I also think we should add to that the very nature of the true crime community, especially the kind of more mainstream true crime community, like I said, with shows like Dateline, shows like My Favorite Murder, creators like Bailey Sarian, even Swoop. You know, they contribute a lot to the desensitization of this kind of content. That is unfortunately the nature of the community, and that is another thing that I realized that I could not handle. Also, a lot of people, because when Eleanor got the backlash, she said in response, like, don't worry you guys, I'm gonna have these experts come on, and these are experts that have been on the case, and they will tell us how they worked on the case, and they will, you know, it'll be like very educational. So after she said that, a lot of people were like, oh, okay, like I feel better about this true crime tour now. But in my humble opinion, I think it's the law enforcement officers that were on the cases that then turn around and try and make a career out of being a speaker that are the issue, that are a contributing factor in the normalization of speaking about true crime in such a sensational manner. Because often, if you notice, a lot of these law enforcement officers will quit being a law enforcement officer to write books, to go on book tours, to go to CrimeCon, to go on TV shows with Nancy Grace. Can you tell I really dislike Nancy Grace? Actually, as soon as Bailey Sarian brought Nancy Grace onto her Makeup Mystery and Murder Monday or whatever it was called, that's when I was like, oh, I need to stop watching Bailey Sarian. Yeah, these law enforcement officers, they tend to make a career not out of helping victims, not out of preventing crime, but out of speaking about the one crime that they solved that one time, you know? And that is what contributes, like I said, to that normalization of, well, it's okay because this is the police officer that was on the case. And it's like, well, no, it's not okay because that police officer quit his job. Like, he's no longer trying to catch murderers. He's on stages, he's on TV shows getting his makeup done and speaking to Nancy Grace. And Nancy Grace is asking questions like, what can we do to not be victims of murder ourselves? So her having detectives that were on the case go on stage with her and talk about the case, it's still not good. You know, I would argue it's a little bit worse. So let's talk about the ethics of CrimeCon and why I believe CrimeCon is an issue. If CrimeCon were solely focused on investigative methods and focusing on the victims and the people who help the victims, I would have no issue with CrimeCon. A lot of true crime creators that I tend to watch tend to be focused on victims. However, CrimeCon does not platform them. CrimeCon chooses to platform detectives like Paul Holes, personalities like Ice-T and Chris Hansen and Nancy Grace, all of whom have little to no involvement in the actual community and in actually helping victims or families of victims. The issue with platforming detectives is that these detectives often did not solve the case on their own. They often relied on tips from the public or from genetic genealogists who did a majority of the work for them. A lot of cases that have radicalized me have actually been cases where the public themselves solved the case because the police was too busy not solving any kind of case. Institutions like the police do not tend to focus on solving cases and instead tend to focus on arresting people. So even if a case is quote unquote solved by them, there will still often be questions unanswered, or sometimes years down the line, the people that they arrested and accused of being guilty will walk free because DNA will prove their innocence. So victims and families of victims don't end up getting justice. And these are the institutions and the people that CrimeCon platforms, which is what I have the biggest issue with. Again, like I said, if CrimeCon were to platform podcasters, YouTubers, and people in the community who actually are helping victims and advocating for justice, I would have no issue with it. If also CrimeCon was targeted towards criminal justice students, I would have no problem with it. But because CrimeCon is targeted and marketed towards the white women who are paranoid of every little sound that they hear when they're home alone, it tends to platform sensational personalities that make a career out of making you afraid of every little sound that you hear in your home, which is highly unethical in my opinion when we're talking about real life victims of real life cases. I mean, the mere fact that Ice-T was platformed over an organization like Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women shows where CrimeCon's priorities lie. Ice-T was part of the cast of Law & Order SVU and is still a part of the cast of SVU. And SVU and all the Law & Order TV shows have spread so much propaganda and have made the NYPD look better than they actually are. The NYPD are notorious for planting evidence to send innocent people, mostly Black and Latino people, to jail so that they can say that they solved a case without actually putting in the effort to solve the case. Not to mention the various individual detectives that were part of solving a singular case, or detectives that have not solved any case and are wasting people's money, taxpayers' money, on chasing loose ends, going on wild goose chases, while still making money selling books about their outrageous theories that they have not been able to prove. But anyway, in conclusion, this whole situation requires, I think, more nuance than people are giving it, and it requires more nuance than this true crime creator has lost her mind or true crime content is bad. Because I think, unfortunately, and with this conversation, I've started thinking about like public executions and thinking about kind of humanity's curiosity for the morbid. I unfortunately don't think that true crime content is going to stop. So I think declaring that you think that all true crime content is bad is not helpful to the conversation, because true crime content is not going to stop. People like Nancy Grace are so goddamn popular. To this day, even after her many controversies, people still look up to her as a respectable figure of the true crime community. She gets invited to CrimeCon still. So I'm thinking like, I'd rather the conversation switch from Eleanor Neale is bad and true crime content is bad to how can we make sure that the community as a whole becomes more respectful of victims and centers victims and centers the change that we can do in systems to deliver justice to these systems. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen if we keep inviting people like Paul Holes on conventions to speak about that one case that he solved. And it was a really big case, and it was a very kind of revolutionary case in the sense that it was the first case where they used genetic genealogy. So I understand kind of his notoriety, but to then be like, oh yeah, I solved this one case this one time with this new revolutionary technology. Let me quit my job. Let me stop catching killers and go on stage and speak at conventions. That is the thing that we need to target as a society in order for this to be better. Because, like I said, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to stop. And I think if people keep saying true crime is bad, the people who consume true crime are going to get defensive and then consume it even more. So I do think the conversation needs to switch into something a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more in a way that actually enacts change. Because a lot of the times people who consume true crime content, they like to say that they're only watching true crime content because they want to make change in the world, or they want to raise awareness of, whatever. But you can't raise awareness of anything if you don't know what you're raising awareness for. You okay, you want to raise awareness. Me too. I want to raise awareness to the fact that justice is kind of a scam. Justice is kind of not a thing, and we're marketed as a people that, oh, going to jail is, justice. We did it. We caught the killer. Yay! But in my opinion, and if I were to become a true crime content creator, that's what I would focus on. I would focus on the fact that justice is kind of a scam. And the way that our justice system is working right now is to the detriment of the public. However, a lot of the people who consume true crime, they don't have a clear idea of what they want to raise awareness for because they really only treat it as entertainment. And so I think the conversation should switch a little bit into, hey, maybe let's not do CrimeCon for a year, or maybe if we do CrimeCon, let's do it a little differently. And slowly start the change there. Maybe let's start by uninviting Paul Holes and Nancy Grace on this convention. A lot of people, if you guys are watching and if you guys love true crime, you're gonna be like, well, what's wrong with Paul Holes? It's what I said. It's that he quit his job because he likes to say, like, yeah, I caught this killer, you guys. Streets are safer because of what I did. Which, like I already mentioned, is not necessarily the case. The geneticist that worked on the case is the one who did the most and the biggest part of the investigation, and they're not nearly as recognized as Paul Holes is. They're not nearly as invited to things as Paul Holes is. And most geneticists who work on these cases are not invited to speak at conventions or not invited to write books, which is not something that you can say for Paul Holes. And then it's like, well, but you quit. You did that, and then you quit. So it's like, but yeah, that's, in case you're wondering, that is the issue that I personally have with Paul Holes. Again, like I said, it was revolutionary what he did, but then he quit. But yeah, look, those are my 2 cents on the situation. Let me know what you guys think. I'm sure you guys will have a ton of opinions, and I'm sorry this podcast episode was kind of all over the place. I do think this conversation requires more nuance, and again, I'm not defending Eleanor Neale. I'm not saying, well, she should get off scot-free because CrimeCon exists and nobody's talking about CrimeCon. I'm actually making the opposite argument of that. I'm saying, yes, we should be talking about Eleanor Neale. We should also include CrimeCon in our conversation and Nancy Grace in our conversation. And people like Paul Holes and the smiley face killer detectives who are also making a living out of a theory that they have not been able to prove. And they are still selling books and selling book tours and going to places like CrimeCon and talking about their flimsy ass theory that there is a serial killer that is present all over the United States and kills people and then leaves a smiley face on the scene. And one of the questions that they have been avoiding like the plague is, well, can we learn more about the smiley faces? How far from the victims were they left? Are they all the same smiley face? Are they all different smiley faces? How can you put them together if the smiley faces are different, or if they're further away in some cases or closer in other cases? But that's what I mean, is we need to not just be talking about Eleanor Neale as an individual creator. We need to be talking about the community as a whole. And so I hope I made that clear. I suspect I might not have. And so I apologize for that. But hopefully in editing, I can clean up my argument a little bit more. And you guys can understand my point of view a little bit more as well. But yeah, my point is that the community as a whole is rotten from the inside out, and we need to be talking about the community as a whole, because an individual creator getting canceled is not going to solve the issues that the entire community has when things that the entire community are doing are going under the radar because they're not mainstream. I also wanted to take this moment to shout out this wonderful and wonderfully well-made video by Maggie Mayfish called "Why Aren't More True Crime Creators Anti-Cop?" It is, like I said, a really well done video and goes more into the issues of why I have a problem with CrimeCon platforming cops rather than platforming advocates of victims. So that is my argument. Let me know what you guys think. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next episode. Be sure to check the description for my merch store and also my new Tumblr page where you guys can get updates if you're only listening on podcast platforms, or if maybe you don't get posts on the YouTube app. I'm not sure how the YouTube app works because I only watch YouTube on desktop. So if you want updates or if you want like pictures, I can post pictures more easily on Tumblr because I do have the mobile app. And yeah, so let me know what you guys think about this topic, and I will talk to you guys next week. Bye.